Have a few minutes of your time and let's do a quick introduction first. It's absolutely with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Professor Phil Willis from the University of Bath to give our school seminar first of 2014. And you know, there's a particularly good connection because Phil was my PhD supervisor all those many years ago when I think I didn't know what computer science was. So you know, it's a real pleasure to and don't say I don't say. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Phil Willis, and I'll just hand over to Phil to tell us about video and visual effects.
That's right. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me. As I've been telling one or two people over lunch, I actually have a connection with Middlesex as well. I was the MA in computer science, computer graphics, or whatever it was, external examiner when John Lansdowne was over at Cat Hill. So that's a long time ago, and some of you probably don't know what Cat Hill is, but nevertheless, this closes the loop nicely to me. It's the first time I've been to this particular site, and it's really been good to catch up on what's been happening. The first slide sort of is a kind of a little bit of an advert. We have a national centre for digital entertainment. It's a doctoral training centre. It's one of these things we've got a big bunch of studentships available, and that's the real joy of it, because the money that comes with those studentships, apart from getting the students, also allows you to do all sorts of exciting things around it. This is a joint effort with Bournemouth University, the National Centre for Computer Animation there. So we split the students between us, we split the effort between us. But it's mainly concerned with digital entertainment as defined by the visual effects industry, the computer animation industry, and the computer games industry. And all of our students spend 3 years in the company doing research. So there's a very strong motivation for thinking about our own research and how it affects those industries, not only through those students, but also through the work we do with PhD students and postdocs back on our own site. And it's that kind of work I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. So just to give you the numbers, that's the kind of overall position we're in right now. We've actually got 50 doctoral students as of today, just signed up the last bunch last autumn. Big effort, but they're all, for the most part, they're all out there, so you know, in countries. So the management side is very different from managing a PhD student. Okay, a little bit of acknowledgements in advance for the people who've been involved with research work you're going to see here. So these are not the engineering doctorate students, these are our own staff and research students. Peter Hall's been the main driver for this work. It's something very much in his research area. He basically sits on the boundary between vision and computer graphics. I come more from a computer graphics background, he's sort of vision and graphics. And somewhere in between the staff we've got at Bath, there is this kind of overlap area where it gets quite interesting. We'll see some examples of that in a moment. The work we're going to tell you about in relation to trees was done by a postdoc, Chris Lee, who went to the Max Planck Institute a year or so back after he left us, and has now moved again because the guy he was working with was offered a senior promotion in the Netherlands, so he's helped to set up something there. Exciting times for him. Chris also did some work on buildings, which I'm not going to show you today. David Pickup got his doctorate. He's now Dr. David Pickup, supervised by me, doing work on water. And again, we'll tell you more about that in a moment or two. The university funded these people. Research students were university studentships. And the Technology Strategy Board funded a bit I'm going to show you right at the end, which is my own personal research, assuming we've got time to do. So let's get on for what we were trying to do with both the trees and the water. There's a general problem in modelling things in the natural world. If you go to a computer game studio, for example, and they're trying to model a landscape, they'll spend a lot of time modelling an individual tree if they want to make it look anything like realistic. And we've discovered it can take up to a week for a professional modeler to do that adequately by the time you've got the branches, the texture, the leaves, and the movement, if you actually wanted to blow in the wind or whatever. which is a long, long time. On the other hand, if you look out, as it were, around the countryside, there are plenty of real trees there, and you can see they blow around in the wind. So the task we set ourselves, or set the students through ourselves, was using a consumer-grade camera pointed at a tree that's moving in the wind. Take a single viewpoint view of that tree over a few seconds, and then use that to try and generate a computer model that looks like the tree and moves like the tree, and can be edited to make it look slightly differently or to move slightly differently. Okay? So we're trying to capture both appearance and movement from a single position with a perfectly normal camera. So no laser scans and all this stuff where you have to work out distances and things of that kind. Nothing too complicated. That's the work we did first, and then we extended that to say, well, can we do the same with water? And I'll show you both those. Very, very different problems, very, very different outcomes. So that's what we just said about the tree stuff. So let's move into that. One thing we have is we have some prior knowledge about how trees behave, which is not in the video itself, but is in our heads. We know a tree is a trunk, it's got branches, it's got leaves if it's the summer, or if it's an evergreen, and we know that the way those branches and things move is constrained. The trunk itself can move a little bit, unless it's really, really rigid. The branches connected to the trunk can move a bit, the ones that are connected to that are thinner and more flexible, can move a bit more. There's a kind of hierarchy there. So we've got that prior knowledge. And if we look at a video, we can kind of see the effects of that. The leaves tend to move around rather more in a strong wind than the trunk, for example. So we're going to take that prior physical knowledge and build that into our code, and then try and extract from the tree a model. Now, just one thing to point out here, we're talking about single viewpoint video, so it's two-dimensional, but we want to build a three-dimensional model. And again, we're helped because we know a tree looks, as it were, roughly the same from different views. We know that the branches spread out in 3D, not in 2D. It isn't really a flat object at all. So we can make use of that. And the best way to do it is to show you the movie, which I've not embedded in PowerPoint because I've got too many bad experiences of trying to do that. Now, let's start with in here.
Is there audio?
There's no audio on this. Well, there is actually, but I've asked for it not to be played. Let me just explain carefully. This was a bit of audio that we put together. Sorry, a bit of video that we put together for a conference. So it's a slightly sort of work your way through, explaining to the referees type of audio track. So what I decided I was going to do was talk over it here, so I can explain to you what's going on in slightly more casual terms, as it were. So that's the people who are involved. So this is the kind of thing you might see. Again, just let me pause that a moment. On the left is a tree photographed at the University of Bath campus, actually just outside the residences, taken on a day when there was a bit of wind blowing, so you can see the branches moving around. What you've got on the right is what we've generated from that. The very thin, twiggy, almost dead bits on the top have been cut off. But the bulk of it has the same kind of appearance and behaviour, because if I let the video run again, you see it's actually moving in the wind. So that's the start and the end. Now, if we look at what's going on, here's our 3D model. So we need to get the appearance right first of all. We think about the movement maybe a bit later. Step 2, the motion modelling to put on. And then if you've got a tree, there's no reason why you can't generate several, and you can make statistical variations on them so that they look similar but not the same. So you can very rapidly build yourself a landscape or a forest. Now we know a tree consists of these individual trunks and branches and all the rest of it. So one thing we can do, did you see what happened there? Let's go back a fraction and I'll talk before it runs again. Okay. What we've done here is we've imposed on the basic shape of the tree a supposed branch structure. So that's our prior knowledge. We're not claiming it's exactly the same as the real tree. We're trying to get something that looks and behaves like the real tree. We're not trying to simulate it because we really need to know the stress of every twig. That's what that kind of exercise. Because you've only got a 2D image, the movie, you can initially only spread the branches and things out in 2D. So our first exercise is to do what you're seeing on the screen here, we produced 3 different planes with the same information, essentially. So we've got now a little bit of bulk volume to it. Because if you do that, when you look down on the top, you just see that kind of star structure, and we know that trees aren't really like that. So what we then do is we go through on the sub-branches, and with a certain amount of control gradient, push them out to the sides of the plane, so they start to fill the volume, and that's what we see at the next bit there. So we're now looking down on this twiggy structure, but it fills the full volume. Now we've got papers explaining how to do this. It's not quite as straightforward as it may sound there, because if you get things wrong, you end up with twigs doing very, very strange things that no real tree will do. And we can perhaps show you an example to that later on. But having got that, you can now bring it back up again, and you can look at it in 3D. And if you populate the extreme ends of the branches with suitably coloured, suitably sized leaves, you can then look around it and see that it does appear to be like a real tree. So that's our physical model. Now, the motion side of it is blowing in the wind. So again, going back to 2D video, we put onto that some reference frames dotted around. We see how those are moving. We track the video locally within those frames to give us the local movement. If we then project that back down, we can see where the branches that we presume to be there might actually be moving. And we can then build up the consequent movement structure on top of that. Again, this is something that we have to be a little bit careful, because if you get it wrong, and you can see examples top and bottom of the screen here, you get some slightly odd, more sort of plasticine type branches rather than the real ones. But again, the paper gives you all the details on that. So that gives us then this tree which has actually got some movement in it, so we can generate different trees. And here we've obviously gone for a different colour scheme, but also a different shape. And you can generate multiple trees which are, as I said before, statistically similar, if you will, in the forest. So one way we can go about that is we can provide a very simple interface to the user, so whereby the user draws the overall shape they want to start off with. And then we populate that with the branches. And then effectively we take that shape, map it back to what we've captured from the live video, to build a tree that moves like the original live video, but is shaped like the handful. So you've got a bit of editing capability, if you like. So we get this kind of shape of tree instead of the original shape of the tree. And again, we can make a little forest of those and put the movement on the side. Now, there are various other techniques out there for doing this, and this part here was the bit where you convince the referees that yours is better than theirs. You've got to do that in a tactful way. So there are 1 or 2 examples here. I'll perhaps cut this off before it gets right to the end, but I'll just show the kind of thing we look at. So on the left is an earlier version someone else did, and if I just pause that, you can see there are gaps in there because they haven't filled the space quite as well as we have. Again, it's the twiggy version, if you will. There's a clear line of sight straight through there. But also, if you look at the way the branches are coming off, they're nothing like it's natural as you might expect. They come off, in some cases, at quite strange angles, which we can highlight in a moment. There's another version somebody else did. And if we highlight some of the branches on there, some of the twigs on there, you can see there's a sort of zigzag effect on the left-hand one, which is not the way real branches grow. So yes, it gives you something twiggy, tree-ish, but it's not quite as realistic as a real one. Now here we've got something with a bit more wind. So we can just simply up the wind speed because we know how the branches behave. And if we look at the actual video and compare it to what we're generating, okay, leaf for leaf it's not the same, but the way it's waving around is very, very similar. And here's an attempt to compare motion across several different papers. And again, if you look at the main trunk and its main sub-branches, you see that they behave rather differently, rather oddly in some cases, by comparison with that. So this is not work we've done completely out of the cold in the sense that people have done this kind of thing before. But we are claiming that we've managed to make a big improvement on some of the other methods. Furthermore, the simplicity of it, a single viewpoint video, makes it very easy. We're not using high-def cameras. So in a sense, any of you could take a camera out, take a video, bung that video into our software and get something out of it to suit the kind of tree that you were looking for. All right, I'll kill that one there. And we'll go back to the PowerPoint. I won't put that PowerPoint. Okay, so you get the basic idea there. Then we've got video, we've got single viewpoint video, and we've got prime knowledge. So we then set ourselves a slightly different task. Can we do this with water? Same things hold, single viewpoint, video, and we know how water's supposed to behave. But water's kind of harder in the sense that it's fluid. It's not a hierarchical structure like trees. It's not so constrained, if you will. Now, we do know that you can model fluid flow very accurately. Plenty of programs out there have been for years that model fluid flow to a degree of precision, but not quickly. And in any case, we're not actually interested in the business of simulation. People are interested in simulation, use the simulation methods. Of course they do. What we're trying to do is get something that's good enough for visual effects, good enough for the games industry or whatever. So it needs to be convincing. It doesn't need to convince a scientist who's going to go in there and measure the exact flow, but it needs to convince the people looking at it that it really is moving water. So we can simulate, but we really don't want to. The ones that kind of build up animations in a relatively quick way tend to use particles and track those through space. So the standard computer graphics technique here, it's become the standard technique, is to have a load of particles which behave according to some fluid-like laws. And you get some really quite good results out of that. But again, if you think about a games environment, you want to do that in real time. In a visual effects environment, real time doesn't matter so much. Trying to do this kind of stuff in complete real time is actually quite tricky. Not because you can't do it in real time, but because you can't afford the time in the game to give to the real-time simulation that other people might use. The time budget on a game is extremely constrained. You might only have 5% of the CPU for the entire physics of the game. Think about that. It's not much time, even on a fast machine. So this stuff is, in their terms, very, very slow. And if you go for absolute simulation, the kind of finite element methods that traditionally people would use for fluid flow jet engines or whatever, very, very slow. Hard to control, something that people tend to forget. If you're trying to animate, if you're trying to get something to behave the way you want it to, then you need to go to editing, you need to go to control it. And that's not the same thing as setting up a simulation and saying, look, we've got this channel with water playing through it, what happens? You might want to do something rather different to what would happen purely by the laws of physics in order to make the thing convincing or to do something unusual. This kind of visual effects you see, a classic example of that, trying to make water behave like a horse or something. There's no way that happens in the physical world. So, what we've done is we started off with a number of single viewpoint videos. I'll show you those in a moment. And we tried to capture the appearance and the behavior of each of those. And then we kind of provide those as a library of different kinds of water movement. And then we say to the user, well, how do you want to bring those together to get the effect you want? Because we're using it to build a computer graphics model from the video, when we re-render it to make it look like water again, we're not obliged to make it look like the water we started from. So we've also got all the options you have in the computer graphics world to make it look different in some particular way. And we want it to be, as we said before, controllable. So there are two assumptions we've made about water. The first is that in all the videos we've got, we're assuming the shallow water equation applies. That's relatively simple to work with, which is good news. And we've also assumed that standard shape from shading techniques will give you the height of the water. So those are just the only two assumptions we've made. They're both wrong. There's a story here. We started off with those things so that we could do a rough cut and just learn what we were going to learn. And we thoroughly expected it to fail. And we expected then to figure out why it failed and improve them. The first time we did this, we got some results which were startlingly convincing, which challenged us a bit, because we know that the water we've got isn't all behaving according to the shallow water equations. So just to recap slightly, if you've got, for example, a wave coming in from an ocean, while it's in deep sea, it's not available in the shallow water equations, but as it works its way up the beach gets shallower and shallower, and eventually you get waves and things breaking, which you wouldn't get out in the open ocean, and that's because you transition into the place where the shallow water equations do apply. Nevertheless, we seem to be getting something right here, and we puzzled about this for quite a while, and we came to the conclusion that the reason it doesn't matter for us is precisely that we're not trying to get a simulation. We can get something that looks like the original, even though what it's actually doing doesn't, even what the original actually does, doesn't obey those equations. And you'll see that when we actually come to it. So it works for us. And the reason, in essence, is that appearance and behavior of what we're interested in, not accurate simulation. So the assumptions are wrong, but the assumptions would only be needed if you were trying to do a real simulation. But they're not so far wrong that you can't get the appearance and behavior to look right. So, that's what it is. Let me start that right at the beginning. We skipped a couple there. Here's some water. Now that particular piece is obviously relatively calm. There's a little bit of wave there, not much. Visually, it's not very interesting. There's a bit of variation, but not much. But as you can see, there's a laptop camera. It's a single camera on a tripod or mounted on a wall or something doing that. We're not waving it around. So that was one of the examples we chose. Well, actually, we made these ourselves in the sense that people went out and recorded it. Here's a different set of waves. The wake coming off that duck in particular is something rather different. Little fountain bubbling up from underwater. Again, slightly more vigorous water action here with splashes going on around it, which are different to what we saw earlier on. We might speed that one up because it doesn't do anything any more exciting than that. Let's go to the next. Here we're a bit like the first one, but now the waves are somewhat bigger, a bit more blown around in the wind. This is a weir. This is actually Pulteney Weir in the centre of Bath, for those of you who know the city of Bath. But there's a lot of foam and stuff coming on there, with relatively complex movements diagonally across the sea. Again, very, very different, but it's clearly still recognisable as water because it is. And again, that one's quite long, so we'll skip on to the next one. Now, the seaside, as it were, here you've got waves breaking very much more. Actually, I think we borrowed that one off the website somewhere, the one that made these things available legitimately in email, to emphasise. But again, so you've now got waves crashing, but we've only got a 2D view of them, so you don't know the actual shape of the waves from it's not properly. And then this is a little cascade. There's a water flow coming down just at the top. You can just about see it. It's a jutting out bit of rock or something and splashes over it. And here's one of the things we produced from all of that. Let me just pause a moment. I'll explain how this is all done in a moment. I'll come out to that. I can't remember whether I've got a PowerPoint showing that, but let me just try. No, I haven't. Right, we'll talk to videos. Come on, I'll wake up again. Okay, try that again. Now, this is clearly computer generated in the sense that we've put together this little world. But if you look at what you've got there, you've got at the top of the fountain, whatever you want to call it, there's some water gushing out, which then tumbles down the side, rather like the little cascade we saw, hits the water at the bottom, produces splashes, so there's a splash zone there, and then there are ripples spreading out from that. And each of those different zones is modelled by a different bit of the video it started from. As you can see, it looks very different to the original videos by and large because we've re-rendered this to be quite clear, sparkling water. But the movement you'll see and the shape of the apparent shape of the surfaces there is all taken from the video itself. Let's just let that run a moment. Some other examples in a moment. This is how we do it. This is something we've been using on our UCAS. Let me restart that. Okay, so we're trying to capture two different things. On the left is the video. Top right with the colour coding on it is the presumed velocity, local velocity of the water, which is coming out of the shallow water equation, and the height, the presumed height of the water. And the bottom one is the sort of geometric effect, where the folds, whether we call it ripples in the water are. And those are the things that we've captured from the video. And because we have a velocity component in there, you can actually use it to influence objects embedded in it. This is very crude in the sense we've got vertical lines here, which are supposedly reeds, literally just vertical lines. But we can get them to be driven by the velocity component of the water. So they wave around as the water splashes around, which is a nice side benefit. So here's an example. This is a water slide. You see there's water coming off the top there, going down the slide and into a splash pool. This is how that's built up. I think we have to single step this time. Give myself time to talk, so let's try and do that. Okay. On the outside there are the videos that we've chosen to use for these different areas. The brightly coloured bit in the middle shows you where those things go. So bottom right video takes up most of the splash, so it's relatively calm ripples because it's run away from where the water comes down the slide. The fountainy bit on the left there, outlining the ring, goes in the green part of the splash pool there, immediately below where the slide is going to pour water, so that splashes up quite a lot. And then the relatively rough stuff around it, outlined in blue, is actually taken from the wave video that we saw earlier. So those have all been captured and blended in, and the shading between the colours there in the middle there is supposed to show you how the blending is taking place. So we start off with, say, the middle of the green bit is pure video on the left, but then it gradually merges into the video to the right there. So it spreads out a little further, which then gradually merges into the video at the bottom there as it gets further away from the splash zone. There's a little bit of trickery about how we do that. Again, we've got papers if you want. Okay, so here we are building it up. So on the left there, the video, on the right, just showing the effect, suitably scaled and then obviously trimmed, so you're only looking at the splashy bit to go in the main pool. Slide as a whole now. The pulpy weir stuff is what's coming down the slide, albeit on a much, much smaller scale. The weir in the centre of that. The cascade there at the middle left video is just at the very bottom of the slide where things accelerate as the water comes off the end of the slide, and the other three as before. So there's 5 videos going into this. But what we've done is built up a CG model, which you can then render, which is why you get this bright shiny water, because we quite like bright shiny water. But because it's now a 3D model, because all of that was CG, it was seen from different angles. Here's the fountain we saw earlier. Same kind of technique being used here. So that's just a CG basin. And then the different zones and the different videos that go in them. This particular one, because it's circular, we've had to find a way of bending things around in a circular arc and getting that to match. And then when you let it play, they all combine together to give the composite effect. Got a water feature in your garden. This is what we did. Not that keen on the kind of marbly texture here. It was a little bit artificial to me, but never mind. But this was set as a kind of test piece. It's basically a cascade with the different splashes and things going on in different places. So again, you can see which videos we're using here, where they go. I think that's like more or less talking to itself. And because that's a 3D CG model, again, you can then move around it and you still see the same correct effect. And then we did a river. Now this is very much a sort of CG scene. We're not as good at this as people can be, but it's a very simple shape. And even the duck gets a lucky looking on this one because we put a stone in the middle of the river. We wanted the ripples, not the duck itself, but the ripples the duck was generating. Again, there's a waterfall there, so you can have a cascade, you have a splash zone, which is limited in how far it goes. And then you fly into it. It's actually rather a shallow river, but you can see all the foam and stuff. Sorry, I could play that a little bit longer for you. You can see all the foam and stuff as you get in there. I'm not sure I've got that one in there again, but I have, obviously. Let's just go back and let the leads one play itself again. We haven't really explored that much further. It would be interesting to do that because we do have this kind of motion thing, and that you've seen, so let's put that to that. Okay. So that's getting 3D models from 2D video and capturing movement as well as appearance, and then repurposing in ways that hopefully might be of use to the industry, or indeed just for the fun of it yourself. It's quite fun to do that. I'm going to do a bit of a shift here now, because this is the work I've been personally working on recently, which has actually gone viral at some point and got a lot of interest. So I thought it'd be nice to show it today as well. And anyway, I'm giving a talk, so I'm sure I can talk about those stuff once in a while. We set ourselves a problem, me and a colleague at Glasgow, Dr. John Patterson, now retired some years ago, of can we get rid of pixels from pictures? Can we represent movies and pictures without using pixels at all? And that sounds a bit like a typical academic thing. Why do you want to do that? Yeah, well, okay. There are some advantages in it. For one thing, you may that in kind of scale-free way, so that you can, again, re-render. So there is something common here. We're trying to build a model of an image and then render the image, rather than just treating the image as it is. And most of our devices are things that capture pixels, so they're not going to escape pixels. Most of our display devices display pixels, so you're not going to escape pixels at the display end either. But in between, where you're trying to do stuff with it, it gets more interesting. We did various things over the years, but the thing that made us really get serious about this was what you're seeing here. We started using contours. We said, well, let's think about the image as though it were a contour map. And instead of plotting heights, let's plot brightness values, or if you like, the height is the brightness value rather than the terrain brightness value. And here's a simple example of that, standard teapot, rendered teapot. And you can see from the contours we're showing on the bottom there, where the brightness levels sort of bunch together in some places, and that's because it's changing relatively quickly there. Or there may be big open spaces where it's relatively flat shaded. So you're now, in a sense, putting the information where it's needed. That's one of the things that got us interested in this. Most with pixels, you put it everywhere because you've got to put it everywhere. Now, just to be clear, we're not proposing that we're going to capture images this way. We still have to start from pixels, we recognise that. We're not saying that we can get something here that generates detail that isn't in the original picture. Of course, we can't. But you can get it in a form that's perhaps more useful. Pixel is a very, very tiny bit of information about a very, very tiny bit of picture. It really doesn't tell you much about what's going on beyond it. And yet, for most of us, when we're looking at the world, see big things. We don't see microscopic things. And most vision algorithms do things like looking for edges, which are extended structures, not just pixel structures. So that was kind of the basis of our thinking before we sort of got deeply into it. Again, we got kind of lucky here. We did a quick and dirty thing. It came out surprisingly well. The thing on the left is a photograph of a cup. Carefully lit, so we've got some shading and dark and grey. It's not just a random cup like somebody's working. And the thing on the right is what happens if you contourize that and then re-render it back again. And we were quite surprised at that. We thought we were going to end up with sort of contourized artifacts, if you will. But it was pretty good. You can see differences. One of the problems with this work generally is I've got to take it off my laptop, squirt it up there, you're looking at it on the screen, and that's obviously not giving you the best possible view. So I have to own up and say, yes, there are differences, but they're not as bad as you might think. And what's really nice is you don't get those kind of artifacts you get with MPEG. You get pixels and big blocks and stuff appearing. So we do get artifacts, but they're visually more acceptable. So here's a slightly more extreme example, a much more recent example. This is a piece of video, it's a frame of a piece of video, supplied to us by Smoke and Mirror from the big effects houses, who've been working with us on this, and allowed us to take some of their high-def stuff and play around with it, see what we can do. And on the right, obviously, the original video. On the left, we've contourized. Now, I have to explain a little bit further what's going on here. This particular one we've contourized using red, green, and blue contours, and then we've upped the contrast, and we've actually trimmed out some of the contours. And all of that is done so that you can see it more easily. Because if you think about it, red green blue is not the right thing to do. You want to work with white UV, essentially brightness, a small amount of colour, which we do, but it's very hard to get that through a projector and see anything sensible on the screen. So we tend to stay with it. The method still works, by the way, so we're not cheating. So that's one example. So we kind of started floating this idea around that we're going to get rid of the pixel. The death of the pixel was a phrase that went out on a press release, and that's what went viral, because that's the kind of thing that captures editors' eyes. We didn't really expect it, in truth. But within a period of a month, I was getting phone calls and emails from all around the world. I was interviewed by somebody in Australia, phones in California, I had requests for information. And the paper we had on our website, sorry, the University Central Repository website, which had been there a couple of years, suddenly became the most downloaded paper of the year in a month. Because a lot of people were seeing this stuff and getting excited about it. Somebody, not us, put it on YouTube, and that was sort of 25,000 hits last time I looked. So it grabbed a lot of attention, which is kind of a lesson on how to publicise things. But in terms of what we were actually telling the world about what we did, there's almost nothing there. It's just a snappy title and video. None of the technology was there. Everybody read the paper, and I can't imagine most of the journalists did. And one or two of them obviously had read somebody else's journalistic report and repeated the errors in the first one, the usual stuff. But you know, what the hell? We got some publicity. One of the reasons we were looking at this is that pixel resolution is being pushed up over the years. Excuse me a moment. And the more pixels you have, obviously the greater the storage demand, processing demand, bandwidth. What's less clear to most people is there are much higher energy costs. Certainly sounds strange. But believe me, if you live in a post-production house in Soho, you know that problem in spades, because they are now at a stage where they're processing so much with so many parallel machines that the local substation can't cope. And they actually have their own backup generators in case their next major motion picture is being rendered at the time that the substation fails, and so on and so on. Of course, pumping all that heat in means you then need air conditioning to pump it out, which takes more energy. So you know, these things really do matter. So we wondered ourselves whether we might be able to get something here which, at least as the size of the image group, pixel resolution group, would need relatively, wouldn't require data which went up as a square. Now, our argument for this is something that you could use professionally. You might be able to use a contourized movie or a video, if you like, as your intermediate, the thing that the post-production house in particular does all their work on. But obviously when you come to deliver it, somebody's going to have pixels to put on the screen. Now, what Smoke and Mirrors told us is one of their biggest problems was actually that the adverts that they do go out in different countries around the world, and they may well have something like 60 different variants of a standard advert to push around the world. Literally, they have to post this stuff off and make sure that the right destination gets the right thing. Part of that is cultural. Some adverts are designed for the world but tweaked for local culture. You can't escape that. You can't escape the language thing by and large. Obviously, you need to have a track that's suitable for the local language. But a lot of it is down to minor changes in whether things are going to be displayed. Is it going to be on the local television system? Is that a high-def system? Or is it going to be on a computer? Or is it going to be on an iPad? Or is it going to be on a phone? And these are essentially all the same thing, repurposed for different resolutions. And in some cases, different frame rates. Something we're looking at but haven't cracked yet. So our argument was, well, look, we can't do anything about the cameras, the computers, the displays, the projectors, but we may well be able to make a contribution in between. Now, the core problem is as follows. If you're in the computer graphics world, you're used to the idea that you create a model with some kind of CAD package. That gives you something that you can render, you can change the way you render it, and that rendering produces pixels. If it's a 3D model like here, then you can change the lighting as well as the texture of the surface or whatever. So this is a standard Stanford bunny rendered to look a little bit like sort of pottery or whatever. So you've got a model, you've got a renderer, and then you generate pixels from that. If you're in the movie world, here's a frame from one of the samples Smoke and Mirrors gave us. There's no CAD, there's no CG model, there's no rendering. What you've got is pixels. You can tweak the pixels, yeah, you can recolorize and things like that. But you haven't got any of that earlier stuff. So in a sense, what that contour system tries to do is to create that model retrospectively, and then say, having got the model, now we can do different things with it than was originally intended. So again, here's an example of that where we've run the contours over. It hasn't done the ladies any favours by covering planes like that, but you can see what's going on. We've got regulated there again, and we've whacked up the contrast and put those out. So our approach is essentially the same thing as kind of terrain maps. The height now corresponds to intensity. And then we try and produce contours that run smoothly through the pixel. Now, this is something we need to understand. We're not talking about stepping from one pixel to another, because that would just give you a polygon. We're talking about doing a best fit contour, which actually slides its way through the data, as it were, through the middle of the pixels. There are two side effects. One is any given pixel might have multiple contours running through, right? And the other is some contours, some pixels may have no contours at all running through, because it's relatively flat shaded at that point. We have to make one decision. How far between contour heights? What's the step? That's the one discrete decision we have to make. All the examples I've got here, we've taken a height of 10. It's an arbitrary number, but right at the beginning we've stuck with it. We've tried other values just for fun. But once you've got a contour map, you've got to re-render it. And in a sense, this is the bit that we contributed. Because if you want to re-render it to look like an image rather than like a contour map, you have to do some shading in between. And that shading has to be sensitive to what's going on around, not only straight across, as it were, the scan line, but around the area where you're trying to find the pixel values to re-render. And having done that, you can choose, for example, the resolution you want to render at, just as you can with the CG render. This one's 500, 1,000, this one's 4,000 pixels. You just generate the appropriate numbers to go with that. While you're in the contour world, though, it's scale free. Okay, so you've got these things in, like, floating point space rather than integer space. I did that bit, didn't I? Right. So there was the same kind of, this is a different frame from that same sequence we were seeing earlier. And what we can see here, hopefully, is that if I go up the screen, point at the screen, we've got some relatively flat bits in the car in particular. Obviously it's dark and relatively low detail around there. There are no contours at all. We've got some bits higher up where things are changing relatively rapidly, relatively bright. The top half of the lady here, the jacket, whatever it is, has got a lot of detail in it. The trousers just blend into the background. So the contours are homing in on the visually important stuff and leaving gaps in between, which we can render relatively simply, where it's flat shaded. If you don't do that, you get this kind of effect. This isn't one we've done. This is just a Wiki Commons image, which deliberately shows posterization. So the artist here has deliberately flattened out the colours there to give this kind of effect. So that's what you would get if you just fill the contours in like a map maker would, because they actually want to show the steps. We don't. So this is a picture, and that's to say that's a photograph, and that was us re-rendering it. And this is where I really am struggling with the projection system, because there are subtle differences here, but they're not that big. You probably won't be able to see them even as I project. Let's have a go. Well, you can perhaps just see it a little bit. That's the original. That's after a slight softening. If you look behind the eye and that's the grays here, you can see a little bit of softening. Is that visible here?
It's above the head of the bird, as you switch between them.
Oh, the sky?
Yeah, you can see
okay.
a certain amount of brightness there.
Yeah. Now, as I said before, the nice thing is that you do get a bit of this kind of stuff. But this is just done with arbitrary parameters as we've set it up. We haven't done anything that tailors it to the image itself. But the problems you get tend to be just that. They tend to be softening and slight blurrings, if you will. But you don't get massive great blocks of stuff which are wrong, which is nice. So here's an example we chose. This is Bad Abbey, with lots of highlights and shadows, strong contrast there. And this was a text sample that we did. These are re-rendered ones you're looking at now. Just to make sure we get sharp edges reliably. Placing contours, we use a standard technique for that. There's nothing exotic about it, but basically you're threading the contour through depending on whether the pixel above or below the line that you're currently drawing is greater than or less than. You also have an estimate of how close it should be to the pixel centers, because again you know the values. There's a kind of steppy version, if you will, going through where we've enclosed all the pixels which are what we've got here. Height, that's the height 80 contour. So all the things inside are greater than 80, all the things outside less than that. Now, of course, you might have multiple contours of that particles image, so it's not just as much as doing one contour for each line. Another example from the, I'll show you the movies themselves in a moment. Another example from one of our movie sequences. Here's a really complicated one. This one's quite interesting because you start to see the shape of some of these things just from the computer. So it starts to become visually acceptable, particularly when you've got the movie, because the eye is very good at interpreting things in images. I'm not suggesting you want to do that instead of having a proper movie, but it does show it can happen. One there, one there. Right, let's do it for real because that's. It doesn't really show unless we do it for real. What I'm going to show you is the best one. When I get there, what I'm going to show you is a little show reel that they put together for us, smoke and mirrors. And the first half of it is the show reel as provided. The second half is the same show reel, re-rendered through contours, and we do some split screens as well, so you can see what the contours are like, what the original was like. So these are chosen to give a range of different visual effects, challenges, if you will, from our point of view. So these are all actual videos that they produce for commercial reasons, for adverts and things like that. Hence, you may well recognize them. Okay, there we go again. So I can do a stop on this as well, just to show you what's going on here a bit better. So I can get my finger on it quickly enough. Right, there we go. So on the right there are the contours themselves. Again, exaggerated, so you can see on the left is the rendered version. So we're working here now with the re-rendered version. Now, because it was a show reel, it's one of these things that's designed to splash in your eyes, and that's not ideal for testing purposes, I'm afraid. So we have done proper tests on this. We've got professionals who understand about image quality, who spend their entire day in darkened rooms looking at professional stuff to compare our images, still images, against still frame against still frame, so we can actually stop and look and see what's going on. And they reckon we're already at professional standard in the sense we could, in principle, use this. So why aren't we? Well, there are some downsides. There always are. At the moment, the data it requires is actually larger than the original image. And the reason for that is that we took a decision early on not to try and do anything fancy in the way of coding. So our data files are basically dumps, double precision dumps, the very parameter we were using, so we could track back through. It's obvious if you look at the kind of resolutions we do, all that could be done with 16 bits, for example, which would reduce it quite a lot, and speed it up quite a lot. It's also too slow for commercial use. So no one's going to be keen up to buy this yet. But what it has demonstrated, particularly when we did the subjective tests from the experts, is that we're getting the kind of quality without having to put in contours every quarter of a pixel or something ridiculous. These are only steps of 10 steps. So we'd like to move on from that. The one thing we're particularly keen to do is to see whether we can get the equivalent benefit going from frame to frame, so that you no longer have a time step either. And you could retime as well as resolution-wise the video. But that's open territory right now, and given that our paper's in public, something that could lead us to that. Okay, I think I'm talked out on that. I'm sorry, I probably overrun slightly on the time I should have done, but thank you very much indeed.
Water first and take a question, I guess, once we'll have some water. Okay, so questions?
I didn't quite follow in the video one. You've effectively built a mathematical model, a contour model. You just showed us effectively a re-rendering of the same movie. Presumably, you could, if you wanted to, develop some tools so you could change the perspective within the video. Could you or is that pushing more?
One of the problems we're having is this is raised more questions than we could answer. So if I backtrack a little, if you develop some, let's say, a new codec in the conventional pixel world, there's a lot of known technology out there that you can work within. There are tools you can use. We haven't got any of that, of course, because it's in some sense a complete science. So that kind of post-production code, the kind of manipulations that these companies would really want to do, is not yet proven. And that's something we'd really like to do. We'd like to try out, build ourselves a toolbox. Not necessarily for professional standards, but to do the kind of things that professionals do to show that it works.
But in theory, you could take a frame from the movie or a sequence from the movie and pan the camera around.
We haven't got any 3D out of this one, unlike the other. So we can't claim that we could pan around with 3D, because this is a 2D colorization.
Right.
There's a separate question of whether these two kinds of projects come
together.
together. Yeah. And that would be really exciting, because then you have a 3D model.
When you do this, are you just contourizing the picture, or are you doing what you're supposed to do, which is submit it into YUV, and then do separate contours which you can combine?
We contourize in Y and U and V, so we're still doing 3 sets of contours instead of RGB, but most of the contours, unsurprisingly, are in the Y channel. It's relatively little in U and V.
But normally, if you're working YUV, you can actually take quite a lot of the data out. You don't need that much other information. So you're able to do the same with the U and the V contours, is actually have much less defined or much less accurate.
Correct.
And still get to see the same sort of thing.
Yes, that's right. It's far less data in the U and V contours. You don't need.
How much less?
Oh,
because it's not that much less when you're working in analog or digital YUV. But it sounds to me like the difference is major. In this case, much bigger.
It's a good point, actually. I haven't actually compared those, because we've simply gone with YUV on the ground, that was the obvious thing to do. We haven't actually compared it in the contourized version to the YUV digital version, the pixel version. If I just, you may notice there was a reference there to the Technology Strategy Board. We've been funding this work to work with the companies, because this is an effort to get stuff into the companies. That project came to an end in November. That's how close we are to finishing what we've just been seeing. What we're now trying to do is regroup and ask ourselves what we want to do for the next phase. So these kind of questions are very much at the forefront of our mind. I can see 2 ways forward. One is, if you like, the purely academic thing, where you might get research council funding, talking about 3 years of money, and you won't know only 6 months when you've got it. And the other is to go back to Technology Strategy Board, a more focused second stage project, which is deliberately designed to deliver some of these things to companies that they want. Both of those would be right on here. We're not running with it.
So there's a question.
You said that currently you're just, just dumping the contours of each frame and rescanning them together. Yeah. So next step could be, correct me if I'm wrong, to take those contours, track them, and try to insert kind of more like to guess keyframes
in between, yeah.
To compress the whole thing, right?
Yeah. We have made a start on that, in the sense we've tried various methods of tracking contours. The problem we're finding there is that it's not reliable enough at the moment. You really get the benefit. It's quite tricky tracking things anyway.
Yeah.
So remember what it is a kind of blob, and it's a line, a curved line, but then that could split into 2 over the next one, and there won't be a match. The bright lighting they've changed in such a way you're going to get 2 contours. The other thing we've tried in that vein is we've tried contourizing in time rather than space. If you imagine a stack of frames, we run the contours that way if you're working in time rather than this way in space. And that does work, but what it effectively does is interpolate from one frame to the other by blurring this one to that one. It doesn't genuinely keep the visual acuity there. It's simply like cross-fading, which isn't good enough, obviously. It's not for professional use. So again, we've still got work to do on that to try and understand that a bit better. We've tried various ways of tracking, and so far we haven't got one that we're convinced by. It's certainly not one that I want to show in public, because there's nothing there that's strong enough.
There's a question.
Yes, thanks, Professor. We've got a question from one of the students in Malta.
Oh, okay.
He's asking about the real-time processing ability of the tree algorithm to mimic the captured video footage.
Okay.
And he wants to know if it's plausible to use it for augmented reality.
Right. Let me take 2 angles on that. The time it takes us to generate from video one of the tree models is minutes. And by that I mean 3, 4, 5 minutes, not 40, 50, 60 minutes, which is a big improvement on the week or so that it takes to model it hard. Then there's the rendering time beyond that. Depends how much effort you try to be prepared to put in. If you want real-time rendering, of course, you've got to make use of graphics cards, which is what any games company would do anyway. We haven't done that. We've simply concentrated on getting the algorithm right. So, but again, it's not wildly slow, but it's not fast enough to compute that. Yep.
In addition to visual adjustment, is there any mechanism to measure the difference between appearances and behavior between simulated model and the real thing?
The whole business of doing analytical comparisons is fraught with difficulties here. I don't know any way of doing that. I'm heartened, however, by a lesson we learned doing the video work. I know you're not talking about the video, but the professionals in the industry took the view that the analytical models don't help them anyway. It's the subjective thing that matters, because you're looking at it. Ultimately, some consumer, some person is going to look at it. So they were more interested in doing some subjective measurements, which we did actually do for the video work, but we haven't done for the trees and the water stuff. So the stuff I showed last, we've done subjective tests on. I haven't given you the results of those, but they were extremely strong. They were very much in our favour, which is why the professionals themselves said, we think this is useful as it stands, even though there are against faults in there. But we haven't done it at all for the trees and things.
Any final questions from here, Malta? It's like a Eurovision Song Contest.
Malta.
The students seem to have got the answers, no?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You're
Really good. Okay, so for the guys in Malta, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Bye.